It was one of those bitter January mornings where the cold didn't just nip at your skin, it settled deep in your bones and stayed there. The wind whipped down Main Street like it had something to prove, rattling the windows of Annie's diner and chasing away the warmth. Most people came in shivering, ordered their coffee with gloves still on, and left without much of a word. Sarah had been opening that diner every morning for 3 years. Same old key, same bell over the door, same regulars who liked their eggs over easy and their toast just a little burnt. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. And steady meant everything to Sarah, especially since her husband passed last spring and the mortgage didn't pause for grief. She tied her apron a little tighter that morning, brushed a bit of sleep from her eyes, and tried to smile like she always did. But her heart felt heavy. She didn't know yet that today would be different. That one small, human moment, an open door, a warm seat would cost her everything, and somehow still give her more than she'd ever expected. Sometimes the biggest stories don't begin with fireworks. Sometimes they start with silence, frost, and a stranger at the window. It was just past 9:15 when Sarah noticed him. She was standing by the front window, quietly refilling the sugar jars like she did every morning, when something outside caught her eye. A figure, motionless, hunched slightly against the wind. He was older, grey streaked through his tangled beard, and his coat looked like it hadn't seen a washing machine in years. The seams were split at the shoulders, and the fabric clung to him in heavy, wet folds. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't baying. He just stood there, facing the diner, his breath fogging the glass, his hands buried deep in his sleeves. But it was his eyes that stopped her, not wild or desperate, just tired. Tired in the way only someone who's been forgotten too long can be. There was a kind of stillness in him, like he'd stopped expecting anything from the world. Sarah looked round. The diner was quiet, 3 tables occupied. The usual soft clatter of forks and cups. No one else seemed to notice him, but she couldn't ignore it. She walked to the door, pushed it open gently, and called out, "Sir, it's too cold to be out here. Please, come in, just to sit and get warm." He didn't speak, just glanced down at his soaked boots, nodded once, and stepped inside. No words, no fuss. Just a quiet man who hadn't felt warmth in a long time, now sitting in the far corner by the heater, like he was afraid it might all be a mistake. Sarah didn't ask him any questions. She didn't mention money or explain herself. She simply walked back to the counter, filled a ceramic mug with hot water, and brought it over without a word. No expectations, no judgment. She set it gently on the table in front of him and offered a quiet smile. "You take your time," she said softly, like speaking too loud might break something fragile. He didn't look up right away, but his hands reached out slowly, carefully, and wrapped round the warm mug like it was the first real thing he'd held in days. His fingers were red from the cold, stiff and trembling. He brought the cup close, letting the steam rise against his face. He still hadn't said a word, but in that moment, words didn't matter. The way he held that mug, the way he breathed it in like it carried something more than heat. It said everything. Sarah didn't know his name, but she knew enough. That morning, kindness mattered more than rules. The man had only just begun to thaw. He sat quietly in the far corner of the diner, cradling a mug of hot water in both hands as if it were a fragile gift, his fingers swollen and cracked from the cold, wrapped round the ceramic like he was afraid it might disappear. He didn't speak. He didn't stir. His eyes, tired and sunken, stared at nothing in particular. For Sarah, it was enough. She kept her eye on him as she moved round the room, checking on tables, topping off coffee. The morning had settled into its usual rhythm, low conversation, the soft clink of cutlery, the hiss of the griddle from the back. Everything fell still. Until the door to the back office creaked open. Brad stepped out. He was only 30, maybe younger, but he walked like he ran the world. Crisp button-up shirt, gel-slicked hair, cologne that arrived 5 seconds before he did. He'd only been the manager for a couple of months, and already he'd managed to squeeze out to long-time employees and install a punch clock system that beeped like a prison gate. He glanced round, eyes scanning the room. Then he spotted the man. Brad's face changed, eyebrows raised, nose wrinkled, mouth pursed like he'd just found a cockroach on the counter. "Who's that?" he asked, sharp and loud. Sarah looked up from the coffee machine. She didn't answer right away. She wanted to answer gently, to lower the temperature in the room. But Brad's tone didn't allow for soft. "He's just trying to warm up," she said finally. "It's freezing outside." Brad stepped closer, looking at the man like he was a problem to be solved. "Did he order anything?" Sarah shook her head. "No, but he didn't ask for anything either. I gave him a mug of hot water." Brad folded his arms. "This isn't a soup kitchen, Sarah. We're running a business." Her hands tightened round the coffee pot. "He's not causing any trouble. Just sitting. That's all." Brad's voice grew louder. "It doesn't matter. We can't have people like that in here. It scares customers." She glanced round. No one seemed scared, if anything. Most people were pretending not to notice, heads low, eyes averted like they knew trouble when they saw it and didn't want to be in the middle of it. Brad continued. "Get him out, or I will." Sarah felt a sharp chill, not from the weather, but from the words. It wasn't just the dismissal of a human being. It was the way Brad said it. Cold, mechanical. Like the man didn't exist beyond his tattered coat and unwashed hair. She looked back at the veteran. He hadn't moved, hadn't looked up. He was still holding the mug like it was the only warmth he had left in the world. "It's 19 degrees outside," she said quietly. "Let him stay a few more minutes." Brad stepped in closer. "He goes now. Will you do?" There it was, the line in the sand. Sarah had worked at Annie's diner for over 3 years. She wasn't management. She wasn't important. But she showed up early every day, stayed late when needed, covered for coworkers when they were sick. She'd memorized the regulars' names, knew who liked their eggs scrambled hard and who wanted their toast barely golden. She'd cleaned up spills, broken up a fight once between 2 drunk truckers, and stayed calm when the fryer caught fire last summer. But none of that mattered in this moment. All Brad saw was someone who wouldn't obey. Her heart was pounding. Her palms felt damp. She could have nodded, said yes, sir, and gone on with her shift. She could have apologized, walked the man out, and tried not to look at his face. But she couldn't. Not this time. Maybe it was the way the man held her. Maybe it was how the wind had cut through her own coat that morning. Or maybe it was the voice of her father in her head, who'd come back from Vietnam broken and quiet, who sat alone for years at their kitchen table, never quite fitting into civilian life again. She looked Brad in the eye. Her voice was calm, steady. "No," she said, "I won't." Brad's face froze. He blinked, like he hadn't expected resistance. Then he laughed short, sharp. "All right, then hand me your apron." She untied it slowly, fingers firm despite the tremble in her gut, folded it neatly, placed it on the counter. "He's not trash," she said quietly. "He's a person. And maybe the only warmth he's had in days came from that chair. And that mug." Brad said nothing, just stared, jaw clenched. Sarah turned toward the door, her breath tight in her chest. She didn't look back. She didn't need to, because behind her, the man in the corner stood. Not in protest, not in panic. But with the quiet strength of someone who had seen war, had lost more than most, and still knew dignity when he saw it. Brad didn't flinch the moment the words left Sarah's mouth. His decision followed without pause. "Then you're fired," he said flatly. "Hand me your apron." The sound of forks clinking against plates suddenly stopped. His spoon stirred once, then rested still in a coffee cup. The soft hum of the heater seemed louder in the silence that followed. It was as if the diner itself had taken a breath and refused to let it go. Sarah didn't argue. She didn't cry. Her hands moved slowly, deliberately, as she untied the apron she had worn almost every day for the past 3 years. The fabric was worn, the edges frayed, a quiet testament to mornings opened before dawn, to orders remembered by heart, to kindnesses delivered with coffee and eggs. She folded the apron neatly and laid it on the counter, like she was leaving more than just a uniform behind. Then she looked up, her eyes meeting Brad's with quiet strength. "I hope," she said gently, "you're never cold and alone." Her voice didn't carry anger, only truth. The kind of truth that lingers long after words are spoken. She turned without another word. Her coat still hung in the back, but she didn't go for it. She walked out into the morning air, the wind biting through her sweater, her breath visible in the cold. Her hands were bare, her face pale, and her eyes shimmered not from the chill, but from the heaviness of what had just happened. Sarah wasn't just walking away from a job. She was walking away from a place that no longer made room for compassion, and as she disappeared beyond the frosted windows of the diner, no one moved, no one spoke. But deep inside, something shifted, because sometimes dignity looks like a woman without a coat, stepping into the cold with her head held high. The door had barely closed behind Sarah when the man in the corner moved. Slowly, deliberately, he rose from his seat. The quiet of the diner deepened. Chairs stopped squeaking. Forks paused midair. All eyes turned toward the man no one had spoken to. The man everyone had quietly chosen to ignore just minutes before. He stood taller than expected, his back bent slightly from age or hardship. But there was a presence in him now, a kind of steadiness that came not from pride, but from something deeper, something earned. He glanced round the room. His gaze wasn't angry. It wasn't searching for sympathy. It was full of something far heavier, memory, a long, quiet history that none of them knew. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, strained by years of silence, but it was clear, and every word landed like a stone in still water. "She gave me dignity," he said, "when no one else would. She reminded me I was still human." His eyes swept the room once more. No one interrupted. A woman near the window pressed a napkin to her cheek. The cook had stepped out from the kitchen and stood frozen, hands clasped, as if afraid to breathe. Then the man reached into the inside of his tattered coat. It was slow, almost reverent. From beneath the torn lining, he pulled out a small object. The silver had dulled with time, edges nicked and scarred, but its shape was unmistakable. A military badge, oval and solid, engraved with a name, a rank, and a word that carried weight far beyond its letters: USMC. He stepped forward, his boots heavy on the linoleum floor, and placed the badge gently on the counter, right where Sarah had laid her apron moments before. "Tell her," he said, voice soft but sure, "Sergeant James McCall says thank you." No one stopped him as he turned and walked out. The bell above the door jingled once, then fell silent through the window. They watched as he stepped into the wind. No hat, no gloves, just the weight of a man who had carried too much for too long, walking away into the cold. But now, not entirely unseen, inside the diner, time seemed to hold its breath. Brad stood frozen, eyes locked on the badge. He didn't reach for it. Couldn't. Something in that small piece of metal made the room feel smaller, quite like they were all standing in a place holier than they realized. Because in a world that often forgets the broken, the tired, and the left behind, one woman had remembered, and a man once lost in the margins had just reminded them all what honor looked like. Even in rags. By the next morning, the story had already taken on a life of its own. One of the regulars, a retired school teacher named Marlene, had witnessed everything from her table. Near the window, that evening, she sat down at her computer, still shaken by what she'd seen, and typed out a post on Facebook. Just a simple message. A waitress fired for letting a cold. Homeless man sit inside for a cup of hot water. A man who, before leaving, placed a military badge on the counter and whispered his thanks. She didn't expect much. Maybe a few friends would read it. Maybe someone would nod and move on. But the post struck a nerve. By noon. It had been shared hundreds of times. By nightfall, thousands people commented, asked questions, tagged others. Veterans across the country reposted it with pride. Strangers began calling the diner, demanding answers. The local news picked it up, then a national blog, then the evening news. And slowly, the fuller truth came into view. James McCall wasn't just any homeless man. He had served tours in Fallujah with the United States Marine Corps, a Bronze Star recipient. Discharged with honors, a man who had once led a unit through fire, but came home to a country that forgot him. Job loss, PTSD, the slow unraveling of everything he knew. And now, he was the man everyone was talking about. Not because of medals, not because of war, but because one woman gave him warmth when no one else did. Sarah never asked for attention. She didn't do it to be seen, or to make a statement. All she gave was a mug of hot water and a chair by the heater. Simple things, given with quiet compassion, but that small act done without hesitation. Without expectation rippled far beyond the walls of the little diner. She lost her job that morning, walked out with her coat half-zipped and tears in her eyes. But what she didn't know was that the world had been watching, not just through phones or screens, but through hearts that still recognized decency when they saw it. People reached out, letters came, job offers. A scholarship in her name was started at the local high school for students who showed kindness when it was hardest. Sarah never sought praise, but sometimes, when you do the right thing even when it costs you everything, the world listens, because real kindness doesn't need a spotlight. It lives in the quiet moments, and when shared, it echoes louder and longer than we ever expect, and in a cold and certain world, it still matters, now more than ever, if this story touched your heart. Share it with someone who still believes in goodness, and if you've ever been helped by a stranger, maybe it's time to pay it forward. Subscribe for more touching stories, because the world needs more kindness.